The morning they put Nora Calder out of the house, the temperature had already dropped to 12 degrees and was still falling. It was the third week of November, 1885, in the Milk River country of northern Montana, and the light that came across the stubble fields was the particular flat white light that arrives before a hard winter settles in for good, the kind of light that makes distances seem smaller than they are, and then punishes you for believing it. She stood at the end of the cart track with a canvas bundle under one arm and a battered leather notebook pressed against her ribs inside her coat, and the dark-coated dog she called Cobb sat beside her left boot and watched the door of the Calder homestead close on the figure of her husband's elder brother Warren, who had come up from Billings the week after the burial and had not left. The bundle held 2 wool dresses, a tin cup, a folding knife, and her father's tools for reading stone. 2 steel chisels, a small iron hammer, and a length of copper wire her father had bent into a plumb. The notebook was old enough that its corners had gone soft, and it smelled of the limestone dust that had settled into it over 30 years in a Pennsylvania quarry, and Nora kept it inside her coat because the cold had already stiffened her fingers, and she did not want to test whether her grip would hold it. She did not yet understand that the notebook would be the reason she was standing in 20 years instead of lying under the same frozen ground that held her husband Holt, 3 weeks fresh in the churchyard at Harlow. She did not yet understand that the barren scab ledge 3 miles to the northwest, which every farmer in the Milk River settlements had always called worthless, was in fact the warmest piece of ground in the county. She knew she was cold and alone, and that the dog was the only living thing that had walked out of that house with her. Stay close to this story, if you will. What Nora found on that ridge is not what anyone in the Milk River country expected, and the winter that eventually came to settle the question was one that no one who survived it ever forgot. She had grown up in the quarry country of western Pennsylvania, the daughter of a man named Eli who cut limestone for a living, and who had taught her, before he taught her anything else, that stone is never inert. Her father was a small man with large, quietly deliberate hands, and he had a habit of pressing his palm flat against a rock face the way another man might press his hand to a sick child's forehead, reading the temperature of it, the faint variation that could mean a great deal if you understood the geology below. He said that stone remembers heat the way timber never does, that it takes warmth in slowly and holds it long after the source is gone, and that a man who understood where the earth kept its own warmth could survive almost any cold a sky could manufacture. He had not been a bookish man. He had not studied this in any school. He had learned it from his own father, who had learned it from the older quarrymen before him, and Eli's version of it was the distilled, unpretentious version, stripped of everything that could not be confirmed by pressing your hand against stone in January and feeling the difference. He had shown Nora the fissures in the hillside above his quarry, long vertical cracks in the limestone face where warm air vented upward through the winter months, barely enough to melt the frost at the lip, but enough if you were paying attention to reveal the living warmth of the rock below. He called it a seam, not a spring. He said the earth has seams the way a coat has seams, places where the inner warmth comes through, and that the trick was to find one and stay near it. The observation was not dramatic. It was simply true, the way most of the things Eli said were simply true, stated once in plain words and then demonstrated by pressing a hand against the rock until you felt it yourself. He had died of a chest fever when Nora was 19, leaving her his leather notebook filled with elevation sketches and temperature readings and small penciled observations about which stone faces ran warm in January and which ran cold. The observations covered 30 years of working the quarry and the surrounding hills, and Eli had written them in the careful, unsentimental hand of a man who did not expect to be read, but recorded what he found, because not recording it seemed like a waste. She had carried that notebook through a courtship with a tall, good-tempered homesteader named Holt Calder, through a marriage in the spring of 1880, and a move west to the Milk River country the following autumn, and through 4 years of homesteading on ground that had seemed good until the dry summer of 1882 killed the first crop, and the dry summer of 1883 killed the second, and the dry summer of 1885 killed the third, and took Holt's heart along with it, the long, cumulative grief of watching a well-intentioned man spend himself down to nothing against ground that would not yield. She had been 24 when she arrived in Montana. She was 28 when Holt died, and she had been a widow for 11 days when Warren Calder came up from Billings. Warren had not been at the wedding. He had not been to the homestead in 5 years. He had the easy confidence of a man arriving with papers, and the papers said that the Calder homestead was titled in Holt's name alone, not in Nora's, and that by right of blood it passed to the surviving Calder family. He was not cruel about it. He said it plainly and without decoration, the way a man delivers news that he considers already settled, and he gave her until morning. The notebook was in Nora's hands before she had crossed the yard, and she had not looked back at the house. She made her way to the scab ledge in 3 hours of steady walking, with Cobb ranging ahead and behind in the way of working dogs who understand that ranging is a service and a comfort, both. The ledge was a shelf of exposed limestone and granite running along the northwest face of a low ridge, the kind of ground that cattle would not graze and plows would not touch, layered with lichen and frost-heaved slabs, and a few stunted junipers clinging in the cracks where wind-blown soil had gathered over centuries. The settlement farmers had named it years before Nora arrived, calling it the Scab because it looked to them like a wound on the land that had never healed cleanly, and the name had settled into ordinary use the way contemptuous names do, with no one remembering any longer that a judgment was embedded in it. 2 homesteads had been attempted on the flats below the ridge, the lower ground that the Scab's drainage watered in spring, and both had been abandoned within 3 years, when it became clear the drainage was not enough compensation for the shallow soil. No one had tried to use the ridge itself. It was too rocky for cultivation and too exposed for comfortable living, or so the settlement believed, and the belief had the comfortable certainty of a thing no one had troubled to test. Nora walked the face of the limestone shelf for an hour in the failing light, pressing her bare hand against the stone the way her father had taught her, moving from slab to slab in a slow, methodical progress that must have looked, to anyone watching from the road below, like the behavior of a woman not entirely composed. She was composed. She was reading the rock. She moved west along the face and then back east, and then west again. And on the second pass, in the last half hour before full dark, she stopped at a long vertical crack in the limestone, where the frost ended a full 6 inches above the ground level, and the air that exhaled from the crack carried a warmth she could feel on the inside of her wrist, a warmth so faint and steady it was like a pulse, the earth breathing. She held her hand at the crack's lip for a long time, long enough that Cobb came and pressed his flank against her knee and looked up at her face, checking. She opened her father's notebook and found the page where Eli had sketched a fissure much like this one in the hillside above his Pennsylvania quarry, with his penciled notes about the temperature differential at various depths and the stone formations most likely to sustain a geothermal seam through a hard winter. The sketch matched the angle of this crack almost exactly. She stood there in the dark after the light had gone entirely, with one hand on the warm stone and the other holding the notebook open, and she said to the dog, who could not verify the claim but did not dispute it, "This will do, Cobb." Then she built a small fire from the dry juniper scrub and pressed her back against the warm stone and slept with the dog across her feet. She began building in December, working in the thin hours of winter light and stopping when her hands could no longer manage the chisel cleanly. The structure she built was not a cabin in any form the Milk River settlements would have recognized, and this was deliberate. She did not cut timber for walls, and she did not sink corner posts into the frozen ground, which would have been impossible anyway, given the frost depth that December. She quarried the limestone slabs from the ledge face itself, using her father's tools with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had spent her childhood watching these same tools worked, cutting the slabs into coursing blocks and shaping them to fit snugly without mortar. The dry stone technique her father had learned from a Cornish quarryman and had practiced on every outbuilding on the Pennsylvania property. The two parallel walls she laid running back into the hillside at the angle of the fissure, not perpendicular to it the way a conventional builder would have set them, but along it so that the crack ran down the center of the dwelling's rear wall rather than behind it or beneath it. The reason for this would not be apparent to anyone who had not thought carefully about where the heat was coming from, which is to say it was not apparent to anyone in Harlow. The floor she packed with clay and broken shale laid over a bed of smaller stones set in a herringbone pattern her father had sketched in the notebook, with the thickest stones at the center directly above the deepest reach of the fissure, where the warmth was most reliable. She built a low shelf of stone along the back wall at about hip height and laid a slab of dense, dark limestone across it, flat and thick as a proper hearthstone, positioned so that the rising warmth from the fissure would charge it from below through the night and radiate it back into the space through the sleeping hours when no fire was burning. The roof she made from salvaged timber, the collapsed boards of one of the abandoned homestead sheds on the flats below, hauled up the ridge in loads of 3 or 4 boards at a time. On a sled she fashioned from the shed's own door, and she weighted the boards with limestone slabs and packed the whole upper surface with clay and dry grass and a foot of packed earth, low enough to trap the rising warmth, but high enough to sit upright beneath. She sealed the door opening with a double thickness of canvas weighted at the bottom with a rod of iron she had carried from the Calder barnyard on her first morning on the ridge, choosing it deliberately over a wooden door because the canvas could be pushed aside and let fall back into place quickly, and because it sealed the lower gap better than any hinge she could have made from the materials at hand. The work took nearly 7 weeks. The last of it finished in the second week of January. Cobb slept in the half-finished space from the second night, and his warmth and the rising breath of the fissure together kept the interior above freezing even before the roof was complete. By the time the last course of clay went onto the roof, the interior temperature on a night of 8 degrees outside was 41 degrees at floor level and 46 at the level of the limestone shelf. Nora recorded this in her father's notebook, in the margin beside his sketch of the Pennsylvania fissure, in the same careful hand Eli had used for his own observations. It was in January, at the dry goods store in Harlow, that Aldous Vane first called it what the settlement would call it for the next 2 years. Aldous kept the store and had the kind of broad-shouldered confidence that comes to a man who has sat at the center of a community's practical life long enough to believe his judgment and the community's judgment are the same thing. He was a fair businessman and a decent neighbor in the ordinary run of seasons, and he was not a cruel man in the way that cruelty requires intention. He was simply a man who had decided, before Nora had set a single stone, that the outcome on the scab ledge was already known, and who saw no reason to revise this view as evidence accumulated to the contrary. He was standing on the store porch with 3 other men when Nora came in to trade a pair of rabbit pelts for salt and tallow, and he said, loud enough that she could hear through the screen door, that he had heard the Calder widow had moved herself into a crack in the rock up on the scab, and that he supposed a woman with nowhere else to go would find virtue in a crack. The men on the porch laughed in the mild, comfortable way of men who are warm and provisioned, and Aldous called it that in every subsequent telling. The crack, said always with the same mild easiness, as if the word required no emphasis to do its work. It did not. Nora carried her salt and tallow up the ridge, and said nothing. She heard the word again at the church social in March of 1886, where Aldous repeated it to a wider audience and added that the crack would not stand the first hard frost, and that the widow would be looking for charity before the autumn. And she heard it again in late October when she came to Harlow for winter-keeping supplies. And Aldous said to the man beside him, not quite under his breath, that the woman up in the crack was buying more than a crack ought to need, with a wink that contained the whole comfortable measure of his certainty. Each time Nora received the word and did not return it. She was not interested in settling this question with words. She had a different proof in mind, and she had learned from her father, who had worked for 30 years in a county that underestimated what a quarryman knew, that the proof would come in its own time and would not require her assistance. There was one voice in Harlow that said something different, and it belonged to a woman named Ruth Mass, who kept chickens on the homestead south of town, and who had herself been left alone by circumstances outside her choosing, her husband having died of a riding accident 3 seasons before. Ruth was practical in the way of women who have had to be, and she watched Nora's work from the road below the ridge with a careful attention that was not quite admiration and not quite skepticism, but something in between, a willingness to wait and see that was itself a kind of respect. She had brought a pot of salt pork up the ridge one afternoon in February without being asked, setting it on the limestone shelf and sitting for an hour inside the stone dwelling, with her hands spread over the warm surface and her expression that of a woman cataloging a fact. She said very little that afternoon. She said it was warmer than it had any right to be, and Nora said yes, and they sat in the warm interior while the wind worked over the ridge above them, and Ruth looked at the herringbone floor and the crack in the back wall, where the warm air exhaled its faint, steady breath, and didn't pretend to understand it fully, but did not dismiss it either. It was Ruth who said, at the March church social, in the aftermath of Aldous' performance, that she had sat inside the crack and that it was genuinely warm, in a way she could not entirely account for, and that perhaps people ought to hold their certainty a little more loosely before the winter had spoken for itself. Aldous smiled at her in the indulgent way of a man correcting a well-meaning error, and said that warmth in February was not the point, that the point was the hard cold, and that the hard cold had not yet arrived. Ruth did not argue further. She sat down, and the social resumed, and Aldous had the room in the comfortable way of men who have spoken the consensus back to the room that formed it. But Ruth came back to the ridge in April with seed packets, and in September with a bushel of dried beans, and each time she sat inside the stone dwelling with her hands on the limestone shelf, and each time the shelf was warm. The catastrophe that came to decide the question arrived in the second week of January, 1887, and it arrived without much warning, which is the character of the worst winters in Montana, that they do not announce themselves the way lesser winters do. There had been a false thaw at Christmas that had run warm enough to encourage the settlement's optimism, and several homesteads had let their fuel stocks run lower through the holiday weeks than they should have. Then, on the morning of January the 14th, the temperature at the Harlow store thermometer, which Aldous checked and recorded every morning, dropped to -22 before 6 o'clock, and went on dropping through the day. By the morning of January 16th, it had reached -38, and a wind came out of the northwest that drove the cold through every seam and gap in conventional timber framing, with a patience and thoroughness that no fireplace or cookstove could adequately answer. The cold was not a dramatic event. It did not arrive with a blizzard or a storm that could be named and told about. It arrived the way the hardest things arrive, quietly and with no intention of leaving, and it settled over the Milk River settlements and waited. The settlement's catastrophe arithmetic began to accumulate in the steady way of cold arithmetic everywhere. The Fenner household, 3 miles east of Harlow, had laid in one cord of split oak for the winter and burned through it entirely by January 18th. And when the oak was gone, they fed fence posts to the stove. And when the fence posts were gone, they began breaking up the interior door frames. The Lundqvist family on the north claim, a Norwegian father and mother and 2 grown sons who had survived a Norwegian winter and knew the difference between cold and serious cold, reported 46 degrees inside their timber house on the morning of January the 17th and 31 degrees by the evening of the 20th. Their iron stove running continuous on a mix of green wood and dried corn husks that produced more smoke than heat. Aldous Vane himself burned through his reserve coal in 4 days and switched to the green wood he kept in the lean-to behind the store, and the green wood left a heavy, damp cold in the upper rooms of the building that no additional burning could fully displace, so that Aldous spent the nights of January 18th through the 20th, sitting as close to the stove as the heat allowed, and still waking in the early hours with his feet numb. Across the Milk River settlements in those 11 days, 3 elderly people died, 2 of them in their own homes, and 4 more were brought into the Harlow house with frostbite severe enough to require care, including a child of 9 from the Fenner place whose feet were wrapped in rags by the time his father carried him in. 2 of the older timber frame homesteads on the north end of the settlement failed their occupants badly enough that the occupants had to be moved, their walls having contracted and opened at the joints enough that the cold came through in the night like something with a will to it. The community's Confident Solutions, its stacked timber walls and iron stoves and cordwood supplies, calculated against an ordinary Montana winter, had been calculated against the wrong winter. On the evening of January the 21st, the 6th day of the deep cold, Aldous Vane walked 3 miles through wind and darkness to the scab ledge with his hands wrapped in a horse blanket and his neighbor Bert Lassen and Bert's wife Clara beside him, all 3 of them having exhausted what fuel remained in the Vane building and having no other place that was open to them in the dark. The walking was hard. The wind came across the flats without interruption, and the cold at minus 34 degrees had a physical density to it, a heaviness that made each step feel like a negotiation. Aldous had not spoken much during the walk. He had said, starting out, that there was nowhere else, and Bert had said yes, and they had walked. The scab ledge rose in front of them in the dark as a black mass against a sky that was very slightly less black, and the path up the ledge face was marked by stones Nora had placed along it in the autumn, waist-high stones set upright like small sentinels at regular intervals, so that the path could be found in a storm. Aldous noticed the stones. He did not say anything about them. He noticed that she had thought of this before the storm, before anyone had reason to use the path at night. Cobb's low sound came from behind the canvas door, before any of them knocked, and then the canvas moved aside, and Nora stood in the opening with a candle. And the warmth that came through the door opening was so immediate and so different from the outdoor air that Clara Lassen made a sound without meaning to, a short, involuntary sound that was not quite a word. Nora said, "Come in," and they came. The interior of the stone dwelling was 53 degrees, which Nora had recorded that afternoon against the small thermometer Eli had kept in the leather notebook case, and the limestone shelf along the back wall was warm to the touch, the way a living body is warm, not the single-source heat of a stove, but the distributed even warmth of a room that has been kept by the stone itself. Ruth Mouse was already inside, having come up from her homestead that afternoon with her fuel exhausted, and she sat against the back wall with a blanket across her knees and Cobb's heavy head resting in her lap, and she did not say anything when the others came in, only moved to make room. Aldous stood in the center of the low room and let his hands come out of the horse blanket very slowly. and the warmth that reached his fingers was the warmth of a room that had not required a fire to produce it, which his hands understood before his mind had caught up. He turned slowly and looked at the walls, the tight coursed limestone set without mortar, the roof boards close above, the herringbone floor, the crack in the back wall from which the warm air breathed upward in its faint, continuous, entirely unhurried way. Bert pressed his palm against the limestone shelf and held it there with the particular attention of a man taking a reading he does not yet know how to interpret. Clara sat down on the packed earth floor with her back against the wall and put her face in her hands, not from grief but from the simple physical release of having stopped being cold, the way the body registers safety before the mind has finished processing it. Aldous stood for a long time in the center of the room. He looked at the floor. He looked at the crack in the wall and the faint, steady breath rising from it, and the frost that stopped in a clean line 6 inches below the crack's opening, inside the warm space, while the world outside was 34 degrees below zero. His expression wasn't the expression of a man who has been caught out in a public error, the kind that requires some saving performance. It was quieter than that. It was the expression of a man who has been measuring the world against a fixed assumption and has just discovered that the assumption was the error, and that the world had known this for some time without troubling to argue. He said, after a silence long enough, that Cobb had stood up from Ruth's lap and crossed the room to sit at his feet. The Rock knew. He said it looking at the floor, and he did not follow it with anything. Nora did not answer because the thing he had said was complete, and the Rock had known for considerably longer than either of them had been standing in the Milk River country. They sheltered 8 people in the stone dwelling across the final 5 days of the hard cold. Nora and Ruth and the 3 from the Vane building, and 3 more who came up the ledge on the 22nd, when word reached the settlement that there was a warm place on the Scab. The interior temperature over those 5 days ranged from 49 to 53 degrees, recorded each morning and evening in the margin of Eli's notebook. No fire was needed for warmth, though Nora kept a small cooking fire in the stone hearth ring near the door for the morning meal. Burning a quarter cord of cut juniper she had stacked under the limestone overhang against exactly this kind of need, having thought through the scenario carefully in the autumn, and having stocked against it without mentioning the calculation to anyone. 8 people and 1 dog in a space 15 feet deep and 9 feet wide, and the limestone shelf warm enough each morning to rest your hands on without flinching, and the floor warm enough that the children from the settlement who were brought up on the 22nd slept directly on it under their blankets without complaint. Cobb moved between the sleeping bodies through the nights in his patient, territorial way, and each morning the temperature outside had not risen, and the temperature inside had not fallen, and the arithmetic of the cold held against the arithmetic of the stone, and the stone held. On the morning of January the 26th, the wind finally broke, and the temperature began its long climb back towards zero, and the people who had sheltered on the Scab ledge came down in the pale morning light with the particular, careful deliberateness of those who know they have survived a thing and wish to do nothing careless on the other side of it. Aldous Vane came last of all, and he stopped at the bottom of the ledge steps and stood with his hat in his hand, looking up at the stone structure pressed into the rock face, the low profile of it, the frost-free limestone around the entrance, and his expression in the pale morning light was that of a man who is not yet sure what he owes and is beginning to calculate the figure. He came back 2 weeks later on a clear, cold afternoon in early February with his hat in his hand and a seriousness about him that Nora had not seen before. He sat on the stone bench outside the south wall and asked her to explain, as plainly as she was willing, what her father had taught her about the stone. She explained it as Eli had explained it to her, which is to say, she explained it as a thing that is felt before it is spoken, that is understood in the hands before it is understood in words. She said that certain limestone formations hold a conversation with the earth below them, that the heat from deep in the ground travels upward through fault lines and fissures, the way warmth travels through a heavy wool blanket, slow and certain and in every direction at once, and that a structure built to work with that exchange rather than against it will hold a livable temperature through a hard Montana winter without burning a fraction of what a timber frame requires. She said her father had called the principle stone memory, meaning that dense rock accumulates warmth across the hours of the day and gives it back through the night, and that a hearthstone of sufficient mass and density, positioned above a warm seam, will do the work of a stove through the sleeping hours if it has been given enough time to receive its charge. She said the difficulty was not the building. The difficulty was reading the ground first, finding the seam before the first stone was laid, which required patience and knowledge, and the willingness to press your bare hand against cold rock for a long time before the warmth made itself known. She said her father had taught her that patience, and had written what he knew in a leather notebook, and that she had followed what he wrote. Aldous listened with the full, careful attention of a man who has discovered the cost of inattention and does not wish to incur it again. When she finished, he asked to see the notebook, and she showed him Eli's sketches and his temperature records, the neat penciled columns covering 30 winters of observation. Aldous studied them for a long time, longer than Nora expected, and when he handed the notebook back, his expression was that of a man who has understood not only what the notebook said, but what it cost the man who filled it. The 30 years of daily observation that went into a single clear principle. He said he would tell people what she had found. She said she would tell them herself, if they asked. The method spread in the imperfect way that useful knowledge spreads in country where people have to survive on what they can understand, which is to say that many tried it wrong before some got it right. In the 2 years following the hard cold, several homesteaders in the Milk River settlements attempted stone construction in the hope of replicating what the Scab Ledge had done, and most of them failed because they copied the form of the walls without first reading the ground, setting their stone in competent courses over cold earth, and getting, in winter, cold stone in cold ground. The lesson, as Aldous Vane repeated in the store and at the church social, and at the spring community meeting with the energy of a man paying a debt, was not the stone itself, but the reading that preceded the stone. And a woman had known how to read it because her father had taught her the language decades before she arrived in Montana, which meant the lesson had traveled a very long way to reach the place where it was needed. Ruth Moss built a stone annex onto the south face of her homestead in the spring of 1888, walking the ground with her bare hand against the soil every morning for 2 weeks before she chose her site. And she chose well, and the annex held warmth through every subsequent winter without significant fuel cost. She and Nora walked the ground together twice that spring, Ruth learning to feel the difference in the rock the way Nora had learned to feel it from Eli's instructions, not quickly, and not from a book but from repetition and attention, and the slow accumulation of what the hand learns that the eye cannot see. A county agricultural agent named Percival Dunn came through the Milk River settlements in the autumn of 1889, documenting homestead survival practices for a territorial report. And he spent 3 days on the Scab Ledge with Eli's notebook spread on the stone bench, and Nora explaining the construction sequence and the underlying principle with the patient precision of a woman who has given up expecting to be surprised by the world's belated interest. Dunn wrote a careful account of what he called geothermal-assisted stone construction, noting in his report that the technique had been developed independently by a former quarryman's daughter working from inherited field notes, and had, in the winter of 1887, sheltered 8 people through 11 days of the deepest cold in recorded settlement history at a fuel cost of approximately 1/4 cord of wood for cooking only, against the average of 3 to 4 cords burned by comparable-sized timber households over the same period, most of whom were still not warm. The report circulated among territorial extension offices, and a condensed version appeared in a Minneapolis agricultural bulletin in 1891. Eli Calder was mentioned by name in both documents, his penciled observations from a Pennsylvania hillside arriving in print a full decade after his death. Ruth Moss kept a copy of the bulletin folded into her Bible, and she showed it to Nora on a December afternoon in 1891, sitting on the limestone bench outside the south wall where they often sat in the afternoon when the winter sun put warmth into the stone. Nora read it carefully and without apparent emotion, in the way of someone who has long since arranged themselves to receive the world's accounting without needing it to arrive on any particular schedule. And she folded it along its original creases and said that her father would have been pleased they had gotten his numbers right. Cobb was old by then, 7 years old and gray across the muzzle and slower on the ridge steps than he had once been, and he lay between the 2 women with his chin on the warm limestone of the bench and his eyes half closed in the thin winter sun, and the ledge was quiet except for the wind moving through the junipers and the faint distant sound of someone working on the Lundqvist claim to the north. The winter sun sat low over the Milk River flats and threw a long, clean-angled light across the limestone face, and the warm breath from the fissure came up through the crack in the back wall as it had come every day of the 7 years Nora had lived on the scab ledge, steady and unhurried, requiring nothing of her and asking for nothing. Nora Calder lived on the scab ledge for 31 years, until her eyesight failed badly enough that she could no longer manage the ridge path safely in the dark, and Ruth Moss's daughter Maren came to live with her and tend the dwelling through the last seasons. She was not lonely in those years, in any way she found diminishing. She had the ridge and the stone and the work of it, and she had Ruth's visits and later Maren's company, and she had the steady satisfaction of a woman who has been proven right by something larger and more impartial than any human opinion, and who has then had the further satisfaction of watching the knowledge spread to the people who once laughed at it. She gave Eli's notebook to Percival Dunn when he came back through the settlements in 1903 for an updated report, on the condition that it be housed in the Helena Territorial Archive where students of practical building could consult it. And Dunn honored that condition exactly, writing Eli's name into the archive register in careful letters on a February afternoon, the kind of February afternoon that made the warmth of the archive reading room feel like its own argument for the value of what was being preserved. The notebook remained in the archive through many decades, its penciled columns still legible, its elevation sketches still accurate enough that a careful reader could find the fissures Eli had marked on the Pennsylvania hillside and go and press a palm against the limestone and feel the warmth he had recorded in a different century entirely. The dwelling on the scab ledge passed through several hands after Nora, most of them people who had heard the account at some remove and understood only that the structure stayed warm in January without the fuel costs of timber building, which they accepted as a gift without knowing the full account of what it had cost to arrive at it. The herringbone floor held, the limestone shelf held, the crack in the back wall went on, breathing its faint, unhurried warmth upward through every winter that followed, warming bodies that had no knowledge of whose hands had set the stones around them, or what a dead man's notebook had said about the temperature of that particular seam in the earth, or what the full arithmetic had been of one morning in November 1885, when a woman with a canvas bundle and a dark-coated dog had been put out of her house into a 12-degree morning and had walked without a plan that anyone else would have recognized as a plan. in the direction of a ridge that everyone in the county had already decided was worthless. There is a kind of knowledge that does not require a name to travel. It moves the way warmth moves through dense stone, slowly and in every direction at once, and it does not stop at the borders of the life that first carried it. Marin Mas kept Cobb's memory in a story she told her own children about the dark-coated dog who had slept against the warm floor every winter of his life and had never once, in all the hard cold the Milk River country could produce, been found shivering. She kept it without knowing she was keeping a kind of teaching, that to notice the animal at ease in the warmth is to notice the warmth itself, and to notice the warmth is to ask where it comes from. And to ask where it comes from is to begin the education that Eli Calder had begun in a Pennsylvania quarry many decades before anyone arrived in Montana to need it. The scab ledge is still there, the limestone face rising in its flat winter light, the juniper scrub still rooted in the frost-heaved cracks, the path still marked by Nora's waist-high stones at their intervals up the face. The fissure still breathes. Whoever built last on that ridge and whoever builds next, the warmth was there before them and will be there after, the earth holding what it holds without expectation of gratitude and without any particular concern for who benefits from it, patient in the way that stone is patient, which is to say past the far edge of any human patience, quietly and without end. The rock still knows.